All right, let's just jump right in with a question that I know is going to sound like it's coming from way out of left field. What on earth could Jewish mysticism have in common with the Protestant Reformation? I mean, on the surface, your first thought is probably absolutely nothing, right? But what if I told you they were actually two streams feeding into the same massive river? A river that would go on to reshape the entire Western world.
Welcome, everyone. In today's explainer, we are going to pull on that exact thread. We're diving into a story pieced together from some fascinating historical sources about these deep, unseen connections, the very things that became, well, the hidden engine of the modern world.
So, here's our game plan. First, we'll look at the hidden financial engine of the Reformation. Then, we'll get into the big ideas that really changed reality itself. From there, we're jumping over to England to see how this all created a kind of mystical mission. After that, we'll explore this wild wave of messianic fervor that was happening at the same time. And finally, we'll see how this whole mix made its way to America.
All right, let's kick things off with part one, the Reformation's hidden engine. Now, we all know the story of faith, of theological fury, but we're going to start with the part that usually gets left out of the history books, the money.
You know the scene, right? It's October 31st, 1517. A monk named Martin Luther walks up to a church door and nails up his 95 Theses. He's protesting the sale of indulgences, which, was basically the system where you could pay the church to get a loved one or yourself out of purgatory faster. It looks like this epic, theological battle for the very soul of Christianity. But was that really all that was going on?
Well, the source material we're digging into today suggests we need to ask a different question. What was the financial machinery humming away behind the scenes? Because this whole thing, it wasn't just about faith. It was about some very, very big money.
Okay, so take a look at this. This breaks down the whole scheme. It starts with this ambitious guy, Albrecht of Brandenburg. He wants to buy a powerful church position, but he doesn't have the cash. So step two, he borrows a ton of money, 21,000 ducats from the super powerful Fugger Bank. How's he going to pay it back? That's step three. He gets permission to sell these special Jubilee indulgences. But here's the crazy part, the real kicker. A Fugger Bank agent literally traveled around with the indulgence salesman, a guy named Johann Tetzel. And get this, the banker held the only key to the cash box. So every single coin that came in was split right there on the spot. Half went straight to the bank to pay off that loan, and the other half went to the bosses in Rome.
So you see what's happening here, right? This wasn't just some abstract theological problem. This was a straight-up financial operation, clear as day. So when Luther makes that comparison to Christ throwing the money changers out of the temple, man, that wasn't just some fancy metaphor. It was an accusation that absolutely hit the bullseye. But all that anger over the money, that was just the spark. The kindling, the dry tinder, had been piling up for centuries. And that brings us to our second section, the incredible ideas that were literally changing how people saw reality itself. You got to understand, the Reformation didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was riding on these deep, powerful philosophical waves.
Okay, so there was this huge philosophical battle going on between two really big ideas. The old school way of thinking was called realism. It basically said that the group is what's truly real. The church, your family, your community. You were real because you were part of this larger whole. But then comes this new idea, nominalism, and it completely flips the script. It says, no, the only thing that's truly real is the individual. The group, that's just a word, a name we use. I mean, this was a total game changer. Suddenly, the individual and your personal relationship with God was front and center.
And happening right alongside this, another incredibly powerful stream of thought was bubbling up, Kabbalah. We're talking about a deep, evolving tradition of Jewish mysticism with its core text, the Zohar. And it was asking these huge questions about the nature of reality and what our role as humans is in the grand scheme of things.
Now, according to the source material, two specific Kabbalistic ideas were especially influential. The first one is tikkun olam. This is the powerful idea that it's actually humanity's job to help repair the world, to fix what's broken in creation, to usher in a new golden age. And the second one is Shekhinah, this concept of a divine feminine presence, an indwelling of God in the world. And trust me, these mystical ideas are going to show up in some very unexpected places.
So you've got this new focus on the individual, you've got these mystical ideas floating around. Where does it all come together? Well, that brings us to part 3, England's mystical mission. Because this is where Protestant theology, this new individualism, and mysticism all kind of crashed into each other and created something totally new and explosive.
And just look at this timeline for a second. It shows this incredible period where all these huge figures were on the scene at the same time. You've got John Dee, the mystic and royal advisor. You've got Francis Bacon, basically the father of the scientific method. And you've got Oliver Cromwell, the Puritan revolutionary leader. These guys weren't in separate worlds. Their lives and their ideas were all tangled up together. Let's zoom in on John Dee for a second, because this guy is fascinating. He was the definition of a Renaissance man. On one hand, a brilliant mathematician and a trusted advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. On the other hand, he was deep into alchemy, the occult, all sorts of mystical stuff. And get this, he's the guy who actually came up with the term British Empire. He saw this grand, global, almost divine destiny for England.
And this quote here is just wild. It shows you how people like Dee didn't see any conflict at all between their Christian faith and these mystical practices. They developed something called Christian Kabbalah, basically adapting Jewish mystical ideas for their own use. And in their minds, they weren't doing something dangerous like summoning demons. No, they believed they were communicating directly with angels to figure out God's grand plan for humanity.
So what's the end result of all this mixing and matching? You get a brand new kind of English identity, especially with the Puritans. The source we're looking at describes it as this really intense cocktail. It was fiercely anti-Catholic, for sure, but also, and this is crucial, it was uniquely pro-Jewish, because they believed that a mass conversion of Jews was a necessary step for biblical prophecies about the end times to come true. So it was apocalyptic, totally focused on the end of the world, and super nationalistic. They saw England as God's chosen nation with a special divine mission.
Okay, so while all of this is brewing in England, something just as explosive is happening in parallel across the Jewish world. And that takes us to part 4, the Age of Messiahs.
The year is 1666. Now, for Christian thinkers who are obsessed with the end times, that number, 1666, was a huge deal. It had the number of the beast in it, 666. This was supposed to be the year. And then, in this absolutely incredible historical parallel, it also became the year that a man in the Jewish world stood up and declared that he was the long-awaited Messiah.
His name was Sabbatai Zevi. In that very year, 1666, he proclaimed he was the Messiah, and his movement just exploded. It spread like wildfire. Some historians estimate that he had a following of maybe up to half of the entire Jewish population in the world at that time. I mean, this wasn't some small cult. This was a massive, continent-spanning phenomenon.
But his theology was, well, it was beyond radical. He basically taught that since the messianic age had arrived, all the old laws were canceled. In fact, things that used to be considered sins were now not only allowed but were holy obligations. The source we're using puts it this way, and it's a shocking idea. He completely flipped the script from salvation from sin to salvation by sin.
And then the whole story takes this unbelievable twist. Zevi gets arrested by the Ottoman Sultan, who gives him an ultimatum: convert to Islam or be executed. And Sabbatai Zevi chose to convert. Now, for most of his followers, this was just a devastating betrayal. It was over. But for the true believers, his most hardcore followers, even this was seen as part of the plan, a deep, mystical act that they had to understand. The movement shattered, but it didn't completely disappear, leaving behind this incredibly complex and controversial legacy.
Okay, so that finally brings all these different threads, the finances, the philosophy, the mysticism, the messiahs, all together in our final section, an American inheritance. So the big question is, how did this strange and really potent brew of ideas manage to cross the Atlantic?
Well, it really comes down to the English Civil War. After the Puritan Revolution, led by Cromwell, ultimately failed, the monarchy was restored in England in 1660. The Puritans basically lost all their political power at home. So what happened? The whole center of gravity for their very unique culture and their radical ideas, it shifted. It moved from Old England across the ocean to New England.
So what exactly did they pack in their ideological luggage? Well, according to the source material, they brought this very specific, very powerful formula with them. You start with a base of radical Protestant theology. You mix in a heavy dose of Jewish mysticism and this intense belief that the millennium is just around the corner. Then you fuse that with a kind of English nationalism, this deep-seated identity as a chosen people. And finally, you sprinkle in those undercurrents of occult philosophy, the kind of stuff we saw with guys like John Dee. So all of this crazy convergence of high finance, radical theology, and mystical nationalism, it all happened hundreds of years ago. But it leaves us with one last big question to chew on. How much of that wild 17th century blend of ideas still, maybe quietly, shapes the world we're all living in right now?